Hi, everybody. It's Achilles Justice here with the Philosophy Society. We have people in the room, new people today. Very nice to see you guys. Thank you for coming. And old friends, nice to see you as well. People online, great stuff. And then people on YouTube in the future, which is their present when they watch it. All right. So today we're going to do two things. We're going to go through some of the discussion of self that we went through last time. And then I'm going to switch over to making progress through the 7 habits. Natalia is very excited. I think this chapter is, you like this chapter, eh? It's a good chapter. I'm happy Ash is here. Nice to see you, my friend. Very good. So I can give an introduction to what the group is for yourself to begin with. Do you have any experience taking philosophy in school, or you do?
Yes.
What did you study?
Social work.
You studied social work.
Social work. I did it as a unit philosophy.
Nice. So you talk about intro philosophy.
Yes.
That's cool. What did you like about it?
The questions, the Socrates questioning.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the philosophers, I love them.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
So here we're going to emulate some of the practices of Socrates in the way that he kind of asks questions. Not exactly, but we want to embody those principles. I call them like philosophical tools in some ways, right? So sometimes what I'll do is I'll write on the board philosophical tools and I'll actually list them. Some of our tools like self-reflection, right? Or critical thinking, or our scientific principles. Those are super useful sometimes, right? And then I talk about the wizard's tower of philosophy. That's a theme in the class, which is basically whenever we reference a philosopher from the past, it's almost like they're in this wizard's tower and they have some kind of like argument, which is like a spell almost, and like has some power, has some force on our reasoning. And so I will identify specific theories or ideas from these philosophers. One, for example, is like Wittgenstein, and to determine meaning is in the use of language, as an example, right? Or like Plato's allegory of the cave. We can talk about that, right? And so the Philosophy Society, philosophy is the love of wisdom, right? And generally philosophers have talked about, like in an academic context, certain ideas. So wisdom has been predominantly reasoning and how we think about things. And so when we talk about like perennial questions or questions that are almost always part of a philosophical discussion, are things that almost emerge in language or from the human condition. And we have to kind of reason them out because they're not empirical answers necessarily. And so like, what is knowledge, for example? Epistemology can be one of those questions, or like, what is justice? Or what do we mean by truth? And how does truth and science function together? Things like that, right? What is the soul? What is God? Does God exist? You're like, yes, please. Achilles is like, I'm sorry, I don't know if this, I don't know if it's going to be true. And so we,
what do you mean by God?
Exactly, right? And so we can talk about all of these things, and that's part of what philosophy as an academic discipline, and it's changed in the sense that in the last, for sure, 200 years, it's been very focused on reading, writing, going to a lecture and listening to people. But wisdom, when we define philosophy as the love of wisdom, wisdom is more than just sitting in a classroom, doing a dissertation or writing essays. Wisdom is the quality of our decisions, judgments, the way we think about things, the quality of our experiences, and how we make sense of stuff, right? And I would also like to add to that in the sense that like being wise is also living well. I think there's something to be said about the wise person knows how to extract quality from their life, right? And so that would mean in some ways an absence of mental illness, an ability for you to harness your life and have control and mastery over it with others in a way that you don't suffer unnecessarily, right? And the Buddhists could say, well, it's an issue of attachment and we need to let go of all attachments and then you won't suffer as much, right? And that might be the answer too. So the Philosophy Society would be a group of wise people, right? And we can spend time looking at specific texts and do what people in university do and go through that content. But I feel that before we even start that, just us being together, there's something about being together as a group that will assume a certain degree of wisdom by virtue of our participation in any group, for that matter. And psychology has determined a lot of information in regards to the kinds of mistakes or errors that humans make on their own and as a group that are independent of reasoning. So to be wise is more than just making sense of things logically and in a reasonable way. It's also how we live together in a harmonious kind of effort towards well-being. And so, yeah, so like certain biases are important to be mindful of and to communicate and to structure the group in such a way that it doesn't have those biases as part of its, as part of the outcomes of the gathering. So for example, groupthink. So the Challenger spaceship exploded because the O-rings had issues with them. And people, the engineers that were aware of that, they didn't have the ability to communicate to the decision maker, or the decision maker didn't take them seriously, and they just pushed the project forward, and then people died, right? And so that was unwise. It was a little foolish to not, like for an organization like NASA, to not take seriously an engineering flaw in a spaceship, right? And that's an extreme case. There are smaller cases with just in social groups that we want to be mindful of. And so that's something that's always kind of a theme that we're going to utilize, right? And so this rendition of the philosophy study, because I have a larger conceptualization of it as an institution where you would learn certain modules of like meditation and critical thinking. You could take a critical thinking class, and all that's within the umbrella. This one is more of like a think tank where I've been going through certain subjects on, or certain ideas on the theory of the philosophy society and different parts of it. And so right now we're been discussing, on one hand, a problem of the self. And then we're also going through, this is one of the modules, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So there's a lot of wisdom in this book, and we're not just going to read it verbatim and accept everything in there. We're going to use our philosophical tools, as you would do in university, and analyze it critically, and not in a way that we want to prove everything wrong, but we want to identify the good parts as well. And there's a lot of good stuff in here. So that's why I chose to go through this book. In the past, we went through feeling good, which is like we learning the philosophy of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And like 70% of people that read this book are in some ways almost cured of depression, right? Because they learn to manage the way they think about things and how they perceive stuff. And they're better able to regulate, their moods and not be upset about things that they don't have to be upset about. So it's dealing with that suffering problem in a different way than Buddhism, but it's effective nonetheless. There are limitations to CBT, like mindfulness is important. And this notion of acceptance is also important. That's different than what we learn in CBT, but the lessons in CBT are still valuable nonetheless. Okay, any questions or comments? All right, let us begin. So, last time I was talking about the self. In the self, I was talking about continuity, which is things go forward in time and how things are together. Are they one or are they broken up? Is it like one unit, it's continuous, or is it broken up into segments? And so 2 of the problems, one was the unit of self. What is that? And then properties of self, right? What would the properties of the self be? And so I wanted to differentiate the self from like certain frames of mind or habit, right? So if someone like, you could say, oh, my cigarette smoking self, right? But the problem is continuity, is that it's broken up, is that you're not always smoking, is that you have moments of smoking cigarettes. If this is our like cigarette smell, self, so smoking, right? The self then would be like these properties all kind of in one, or like all these ones right here would be a self. But it's not in one unit. There's like a time lapse in between them. Like sometimes people will smoke when they first wake up, and then they'll do some stuff, and then maybe they get stressed out and they have a cigarette again, right? And so I think that when we talk about unit of self, it's important that the self is a distinct entity by time. And maybe this is just a utility thing, and that's, in some ways you could say, we could argue and criticize that. But I feel that it's important because we want to differentiate it from just habit, right? Because then there would be no difference between self and habit. And I would like to say, from a utility context, it's more valuable to us to see it as a distinct unit that we can break up. That's not broken up by time, because, for example, when we have the atom, and in here we have our protons and neutrons, and there's like the electron field, in different atoms, right? There are different degrees of electrons and protons. Like, there are electrons in all of them, but you wouldn't say that the electron is the feature that makes an atom an atom. It's the amount of electrons and protons and neutrons in each unit that makes it an atom. The unitness is not the electron, like the atom. So what that can do is it can help you reduce the frequency of smoking in this self-expression. And then there would be other properties that would compose what the self is in that specific moment. And so I feel that the utility of that is much higher. This is a continuation from the previous discussion had the last 2 weeks.
You mean you could replace some of the properties with some new properties to improve the situation of the human being?
Exactly, yeah. So the way I just, you watched the previous ones, right?
A little bit, not that.
Yeah, so we have the being, and that is existence over time. So that's the totality of your existence, that's your being. And there's like, you could say direct being, like what I'm doing and the direct causal or implications of what I've done. But then there's like causal factors that have happened indirectly of my existence. So like someone told you about me, you know, or I talk to you and then there's an effect from you. That's still derived from my existence in some causal way. Because if you remove me as a property, there would be a whole domino effect of causality that would be taken out, right? So your being isn't just you and what you interact with, but there's also this indirect interaction.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. So like, let's say you have like, you're playing pool and you have the pool cue and you hit like the seven ball. So cue, 7 ball, and the 7 ball hits like the 8 ball, right? So this is the cue. So the 7, I have a direct contact with the 7, right? So I make decisions and do things in my life. And then the decision I make is to hit the 8 ball, right? So I directly impacted everybody in this room. But then from there, this thing goes and hits the 2 ball. I didn't actually touch the 2 ball. It was the 8 ball, but through the causal mechanism, I was the thing that if I wasn't there, if this mechanism didn't exist, then the 2 ball would have never moved. So it's still kind of, it still has to do with your existence. Because if you didn't exist, the other implication wouldn't have occurred. It's just not direct to you. It's an indirect implication, right? But I still feel that it's in the totality or all of time or totality. It still has something to do with your existence in some way. It's not devoid of your existence. Now you could say that like people talk about the butterfly effect. Well, there's some indirect exposure to your existence in the cosmos to some degree at all. And I guess that's true. And we could argue that it goes on ad infinitum, that it becomes almost a slippery slope, right? Not slippery slope, but ad infinitum. And so there'd have to be some limit there, I think. So what would that limit be? We can talk about that later. I'm not really sure. But I think there is some degree of direct and indirect influence of your existence, right? The things, the decisions you've done directly, and then the implications from that. I'm not sure how far that chain of reasoning would have to go, because it could go on forever in some ways, you know, and that's the problem of causality itself. So I don't know. But anyways, point is when we talk about the being, if this is all of your life, from like birth to like your death, there are moments of your existence that I would say is like your self-expression. This is your being expressing it in that moment. And so the first thing to figure out is, what is the unit of self? What would that thing be within that moment in a limited form? How do I distinguish it from other elements of self or other self-expressions, other elements of being? And what would it be composed of? What would its properties be? And so they may all share similar properties as different atoms do. They all have protons, for example, but an atom and a proton are not the same thing. It's not the, like there is a level of explanation. So when we look at like, so we have like atom, and then we have some subatomic particles like protons, neutron, electron, right? And then you could probably go further, I'm not sure, quarks and stuff like that. And then we have like molecules, right? So the self would be like equivalent to the atom in some ways. And what would the component parts of the self be, right? And then you might be able to combine different small selves to make like a molecule self or like a combination self in some ways. So the point would be that self has certain properties. One would be like behaviors, which when you accumulate them together over time, they become habits, right? And then emotion is another one. And emotion is on like a spectrum of like, it could be zero as it's, in this context, it's a categorical property. So it could be zero in this particular instance, but it has the capacity to be intense or intense on a positive or negative scale, right? Within each category.
Since you're talking about atoms and energy and whatnot,
Yeah.
A wise man once told me that emotion is energy in motion. That's why it's called emotion. It's short form for that.
Yeah, well, it's actually about motivation. It's like, emotion is like, it's where we get our motivations from. It's like an inner motivation because it's inside you. Your emotions are not external to you. I might have like food that's external, but if my motivation comes from within, it would be emoted.
Noted.
And the reason I'm talking about self in this way is because you can think sometimes when you reflect and you're like, I don't like the way I was. I wasn't my best self, or I didn't act well in that moment. I think that what you're doing is you're actually when you're using your self-awareness, you're like looking at the being is looking at past selves, and it's making a unit out of the self and saying, this specific unit, I'd like to take it out and replace it with a different one. Right? And so I feel that I'd like to think that there's some way to represent this relationship symbolically that has operators that work with certain properties. I don't want to say numerators because it's not a quantity issue, right? We're not doing like arithmetic here. And so that's why I've been talking about this recently. And so the progress from last week is this notion of continuity, that I feel that it is important to distinguish self based on time, that it wouldn't make sense to talk about habit as self. And the reason for that is because even in the analogy of the atom, just because every atom has an electron, for example, doesn't mean that atoms and electrons are equivalent. So if every self has a habit in it or some form of behavior, doesn't mean that they're the same thing. There has to be some other way to distinguish self from habit, even though it's always part of it as a property. I'm confused by this too. So it's not that I'm not looking for answers necessarily from anybody. We're just thinking about it. All right, let's leave it like there for now. That's good enough for self-talk for today. And we'll talk about the 7 habits a little bit. There's more thinking needed, more reflection and thinking.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Because you talk about it seems to me that you talk about self-reflection, but it seems like the two self. One is this self-observing, this objective self.
Yeah.
And then I identify, this is the habit. This is what. But what is this self that is observing? I also kind of thought about the Heidegger's Dasein, the concept Dasein, because actually most of the time we're not in the self-awareness. We didn't, Heidegger said you didn't realize that the hammer until the hammer is not working, and then you because the more original state of a human being is that we would just live, we just throw into this world, right? So I'm not saying that, I just wonder what does it mean? Is there any relation between the Dasein and then what we're talking about here?
Yeah, like Heidegger's talking about like being there. Like right now, we're in an experience from our first person perspective. And that's what Dasein is, right? And I just took an existentialist class like in the fall time, which was really good. This I am not doing a Heideggerian perspective. I am being analytical, in the sense that I'm trying to step out and apply some language or analytic process to the things that Heidegger is talking about to some degree. But Heidegger would say that you can't even do that. That like your entire approach is incorrect. He would criticize this whole approach. Like, it doesn't make sense to even do that. We need to like step back from that whole way of thinking propositionally, right? Or in a predicate sense, a predicate logic. And so part of it is that there's the being, and then from that consciousness exists, right? And varying degrees for certain kinds of beings. And then self models are produced. And some of those conscious beings, i.e. us, have self-awareness. So it doesn't make sense to communicate with, like, you have to use reward and punishment in some ways to teach animals things. You can't converse with them, right? And say, don't act that way. And then they know what you're talking about, right? Like, I have some language with my dog, but her capacity for self-awareness is like, you know, very, 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 very minimal, you know, if even existent at all. Yeah. And so this is kind of for us or other beings like us that have self-awareness to whatever degree we have. And so when we talk about consciousness, like the self is produced as a model, right? But I'm not using it in a model sense. That only occurs in the reflective process. There's the being in the moment and how you're expressing yourself in the moment, which is the docile part. But what I'm doing is I'm going back, and in that self-reflective process, I'm saying, what are those properties? And can you have self-control and be aware of yourself, manipulating the properties of yourself while you're doing stuff, you know? Because then you can identify certain, like even Stephen Covey talks about this. He says, pick your best sense of self and be that sense of self in some ways. You know what I mean? And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit today. So yeah, I'm just like working through the confusion with you guys because I think it's important. I think if you don't allow yourself to be a little confused, and it's okay to be a little confused in front of other people. We tend to not do that because we get scared of not being perceived as an expert. People will think you're an idiot or something like that, you know? But how are you supposed to have progress in new ideas? And if you do it alone, then I think there's less, you're gonna have less progress in some ways. It's better to do it with others and feel a little bit of that pressure. So I expose myself and I be vulnerable, you know, in this environment. And then I think about it throughout the week. And then when we come back next week, I'm like, this is what I thought in the last week. And so if you guys are here frequently, you'd be like, and I've also thought of this. And I'd be like, really? That's interesting. Right? Okay. Anything else?
So it's basically suppressing the ego then, is what you're saying.
So I would say the ego
That's
is one of those parts of self, right?
Yeah, we're like, it's the ego that's like, oh, like, I don't want to seem like an idiot. Oh, I don't want to seem bad. I don't want to seem this and that. Like, that's all the ego speaking to fulfill or to pertain your image, your self-image that you've like created for yourself, in my opinion. And like when something counters that through being vulnerable, you hesitate. And I feel like that's why you get scared, or like we get scared.
Yeah, the ego would be one property of the self, I would say. It would fall in the category of narrative and belief. And it would just be a specific belief about you. It's self-belief, or what psychologists would call self-concept. But then there's other properties too. And some people may have brain damage, or they have developed in a certain way that they lack a property. Like some people may not feel emotion in the same way, right? Or they're like super depressed and they are like apathetic, you know, or have adahenia. They don't feel pleasure, you know? And so that's a specific condition that's developed, but the human condition in general is such that has a specific capacity, even if it's zero, right? And so it's just like doing like an arithmetic equation where you have like the bed mass formula. And even if there are no brackets in the equation you're solving, you still solve the rest of the formula, right? But there's a capacity for that to be there. Same thing in the self model, is that it may have this capacity in any instance. It's just that it may not be present in this very instance. And so that's why I say it's categorical as a functional element. And then the way that it's like specific in the situation can be dimensional. So my emotions can like fluctuate on a spectrum, for example. It can be really, really intense for a specific thing. You know, like if someone like hurts your child, you're like, rah, you can get really upset, you know, in that moment. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Hi, just wanted to contribute a little bit. I like the question, and you know, I thought about the self and the ego a little bit, and I have a theory that comes from observation to an extent, right? It's mostly not, I wouldn't say empirical, because it's not like, you know, deep research into it, but it's just like from observation and experience. I would say that, you know, consciousness and ego and self, I don't think they necessarily have to be the same thing. I think they might be, you know, two different things that coexist. Because I know about, you know, stories of people like taking weird drugs and
Yep.
feeling out of themselves, like feeling one with everything else, and there's no
Mhm.
longer any ego. They feel like there is no self, right? As if they explain it as if they're in an ocean type of thing, right? And they're part of the ocean. They're part of the thing in general, right? So I think, you know, a sense of self is something simulated by the body and by the mind, and I think it's just like more of a natural I mean, it's a more of a bodily thing, where while consciousness, while also being, you know, a result of the body, is kind of like something separate, right? Like, just like, you know, software is a result of hardware, but it's, you know, kind of separate, right? It could
Mhm.
have, you know, separate effects and stuff like that. So the way I think about it, I think those might be different things, and not only different, but they might also be like kind of opposing things at the same time. I think, as you said, like ego and self might take over in times of like when it's, you know, severe harm or like alarm or like, you know, fight or flight situations. It's mostly you're not reacting, your body takes over, your ego takes over. Whereas situations where it's more favorable, it's more you know, accepting for you to be like, you know, express yourself more. I think it's more of your conscious acting. So I think those might be like two opposing things acting, you know, one taking over and the other, like, you know, struggling to take over, like depending on the conditions outside, overall helping the, you know, the animal, which is us, the person, to survive.
Yeah, well, the animal, the being, right, is conscious, and the animal is producing consciousness. And we can tell because if you get brain damage, then your capacity for consciousness is diminished. So we know that consciousness is contingent on the brain, for example. And then in this specific kind of being, even if you're in a state of meditation, like I don't think you can actually fully get out of yourself. You know, like there's the identity self, and we talked about like, who am I? You're always you. But that's not the question. The question is what? What is the content of myself? Or what are the properties of myself? Or what is the unit of self? What is the thing that is the boundary of selfness? That in some ways is a representation of my being in this moment, right? Which you could talk about Dasein as a form of self, but it's not like, not that which we speak, it's that which we are. Now, it's the nowness of what we are. And so even in those moments of meditation or on DMT or mushrooms or LSD or whatever, those aren't weird drugs. Weird drugs are drugs we don't know about. We know about those drugs. Those are awesome drugs. They are. They're
I
good.
just don't want to take like what are those other ones? Bath salts and
Those are weird drugs.
crocodile. You heard of that one?
I don't know. Yeah, those are
Similar to bath salts.
unrecommended drugs. Don't do those ones, right? But psychologists have been studying like the effects of like MDMA and LSD and mushrooms, and they're done in the correct way, in the correct context. It can be a very healing process, right? And so even in those moments of deep meditation, if there is no drugs present, it would just be like you would just be like putting zero to those properties of self, but the container of self still is there, even though you've kind of like quietened it down. You turn the volume down. You don't really remove the knob, because the only way to do that is to like hit yourself in the head. You're not like, don't do that, you know?
Yeah.
So you may not feel it, but it's still technically there,
Yes.
right? And so I think there's something to be said about that, and that can increase our capacity for more objective awareness. And that is in some ways part of the, like, I'm using this as an analogy, the chemical mixture of having a sound self is to frequently turn the knob down to zero and then let it go back up. That way you can have kind of a baseline of what is independent of, like, to be mindful is important, right? Like there's evidence, we can talk about the evidence of mindfulness and meditation and that kind of stuff, you know, that we're transitioning into that. Yes, Vikas.
Hi, how are you guys?
Good.
Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, to everybody here, I am a Buddhist and I've been studying Buddhism for about a few years. In terms of the self, so in terms of Buddhism, we actually investigate what the self is. So I've done this meditation for a very long time, and so the thing how you describe it in terms of the brain generating consciousness, when you actually do the meditation, it's actually the other way around because you become fully aware of what you are and you have a direct experience, right? And then you realize that only consciousness has to be there to even perceive that there is such thing as a brain, right? And it's going to be hard for me to explain this without people having the direct experience. But when I had my first insight, I realized that holy crap, I now know what I am, because the point of the meditation is to pinpoint, locate exactly where you are. And once you start doing that, you realize that it's actually not localized. It's not inside your body, nor is it outside. So you actually don't even have a self. So I'm going to agree with the guy that was first talking, saying that the sense of self is actually generated because it comes after consciousness. So consciousness is actually prior to
Yeah.
self. And within consciousness, what ends up happening is you were born and then there's sounds coming at you, and then you start making up the identity of what you think you are. So which is, well, I'm not going to go too deep into it, but pretty much that's what Buddhism is. You start unraveling the layers of what you think you are, and then you're left with what you are. So this is
Oh, very
done
good.
not through scientifically, but it's done through a direct experience. And scientists will disagree on this, but until you actually do the meditation and you have the insights, then you will obviously have to say, oh yeah, it's happening from the brain. But there's no actual proof other than brain signals. But those signals are, remember, they're a measure of science, and science has produced those same measures in order to validate what they're doing. So of course, so there's a lot of things where scientists have done a really good job. I respect it, but in terms of the self, there's no way that science can prove what it is. It's just not true.
Well, I don't know about that, my friend. Like, I feel that we can measure the brain and we can compare brain signals.
But
from different-
that's not accurate. For you to say there's right brain activity, left brain activity, well, this means that could mean anything. You know what I mean? What I'm saying is, sure, it might be a little bit of an indicator, but versus a direct experience, there's absolutely no way.
Well, again, I think you need to. I think all experience. Like we've talked about this before, but what do you say? Direct experience? Can you define what you mean by that?
Yeah, direct experience. So basically, in terms of Buddhism, there's a self-inquiry meditation. So that's the very first thing that I did. So what you do is you drop your mind, you drop your thoughts and everything, and you just are in your body, you observe what you are, and you slowly, it's very hard because there's so many built up layers of what we think we are. There might be you where you're the professor of this class, or you're a part of a family member. So there's so many of these layers built up, right? So basically you start unraveling these layers, and then you start getting these insights. And as soon as you have your insight, it's hard to explain it, but it's an intuitive knowing. It's like, oh crap, I know now. So when you talk about people having their awakening experience, and when you see certain monks, they have this certain demeanor to themselves, and it's not like they're faking it. You can tell that they've picked up something. It's because of their insights, of their direct experience. So there's no way. Try telling a monk about your science. He'll listen to it, he'll be nice about it, but he can never ever fall into it because he actually has a direct knowing. And that only intuitive will come from direct experience. That's why there's a huge battle that goes on between spirituality and science, and they go back and forth, but it's very hard to know what it is until you've actually done it. And to do it is extremely difficult, because we're talking about the fabric of reality. This is not a course you can take. You have to develop a heart. You have to be like, oh, I want to really know this. And then if your inner self allows you, then over time it slowly gets revealed to you. That's why the awakening process is considered a great process, but only a few attain it in this lifetime. There's a reason for that.
Yeah, that's similar to like what David was talking about in the context of Dasein, like that you being in the moment and your experience in the moment is
Right.
something that is different than like a scientific study. But like just the way that you're using science is almost an anti-science like narrative. And
Well, remember,
science,
science has built up its own parameters.
Yeah,
So of
but
course,
hang on.
you can't use those parameters into knowing what you are.
Akash, 1 second. You gotta let me finish, okay, buddy?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Remember to breathe when you're listening, okay?
Okay.
I know you're excited and I appreciate that you're here. So science is a way for us to establish our knowledge and to replicate the knowledge that we've gained and to make sure that our biases are not filtered into the knowledge itself. So if we say that we see something, we want to make sure that our perception is not due to like being colorblind or like, you know, the nerve in front of your eye, making things look distorted or whatever. We want to try to have another set of eyes to confirm what we think we know. That's all really science is trying to do.
Yeah, but
And-
that's within science.
Yeah, and there's limitations to science, and that's why it's
Of course,
being
yeah.
philosophical is how we can make sense of all things, right, including our experience. And some things we can be scientific about, and some things may not even be necessary, right?
That's exactly my point.
Sure.
The
Okay.
science cannot reveal all the answers. Yeah.
1 sec. Yeah.
May I ask a question? I mean, I respect Buddhism because myself also went to some like 15 days retreat, you know, in mindful, you know, mindfulness. I forgot about what's the name.
Vipassana.
Huh?
Vipassana.
Vipassana. Yeah, I went twice, you know.
It's cool.
That's cool. Yeah, yeah. But I still have these questions, you know, like we talk about, detachment. But the question is, we have a body. How can you detach when you are in a concentration camp, when you are being tortured in a cross? You know, I sit there, I sit there nicely. You know, even I'm hungry. You know, because they only give you one meal. You know, whatever. But you know, I kept thinking, you know, that's you know, that's not an extreme situation because as a human being, we have the possibility to encounter those, you know, in extreme, you know, you're being tortured, you know, in concentration camp, you know, in a war, you know. I don't know how the monk will behave in that kind of situation. You know,
We ethically can't study that.
can they fully detach? Because I'm from China, you know, so there's a Tibetan monk.
Nice.
They are against the communism. They burn themselves. You know, that there's a few of them, you know. So and it's a tragedy, you know. So and I you know, can you still detach? I mean, is that the no self? You know, when you're facing that kind of extreme? If it's not, then I kind of question, you know, how far? Because Buddha himself, you know, if you look at the sea, he sit below a tree.
Yeah.
Like you know, he decided I have to figure these things out. You know, he was not tortured. You know, he was not put in Auschwitz. You know. So you probably see, or we all read the Viktor Frankl's, you know,
He goes into that too. Yeah.
right. So that's my question. You know, how much this detached things, you know, is that a limitation to this detachment?
Well, there's like you're going through it yourself, right? You're giving examples of extreme situations that monks put themselves through, and they maintain their, you know, I guess, integrity to their goal, to the point where some of them just starve themselves to mummification. They don't drink water, they don't eat, and they just stay in a meditative position to the point where they just die in that position.
You know what? To further elaborate, first of all, there's a lot of things that you're talking about, like these monks, like in terms of the physical sensation of pain, right? So these guys have let go of their own life, so they don't have the same fear of death that we do. And in terms of those monks that set themselves on fire, you've seen them; they sit completely still, and then when they die, what ends up happening? Their body tips over, right? So in terms of letting go of the attachments, of course you can detach yourself. We're literally talking about you not even existing, and you're experiencing a bunch of sensations of you being tortured, which is in the body, right? So can you actually do it for real? Of course, 100%. But what we're talking about being detached is this complete reality itself. The physical thing is, that's because in your own mind, you think death is a big thing. That's why you view it like, oh my God, torture. But you detach even the thought of that because you realize that you've always been alive and you can't really die. So even that experience of torture, these monks, they end up enjoying the experience from a point
I
of
don't know
love.
about enjoy, but
I don't know.
I don't think
I
about
don't
it.
know about that
From,
because,
from a point of
anybody,
love.
like, when you give birth, I think women, there's a different degree of, because to me, it's very vivid, somebody punch on my face,
Mhm.
I immediately know,
Well,
the
you're
pain.
not listening to, I'm
No
not
matter
saying the
how
pain
many
isn't
times-
there.
Because let him finish.
No matter how
Oh,
many
sorry, go ahead.
times, I went through that 15 days, I sit there, it's actually, they taught you, to observe, the feeling in each area of the body. You kind of like scan through your body, and then if you observe it long enough, you see those things kind of disappear, But I suspect, those are maybe the level, maybe still, I cannot compare that to I'm like a crucified, or
Yeah.
there's so many, or putting a paper, pouring water. There's so many things, so many extremely. So even the monk, I don't know, nobody's those monks who burn themselves, because they burn themselves, they don't know, because there's a moment, they kind of already lost control, How do we know? They, so it's probably it's a big uncertainty. I don't know.
We don't have
It's
to know.
but it's
Let's not know, 'cause
but
what
it's
if people
physical.
back to
You're
sadistic-
talking about physicality here. You're talking about a physical pain here. What are you uncertain of? There's boxers that box 12 rounds, so they're getting hurt. They're really getting brain damage, but they're not willing to give up. They're going to die until they win the fight. You don't even need to go towards torture. Just go look at a regular boxing fight, So,
Sure.
so you don't need to be uncertain of that. We'll just look around you. There's people that are willing to go through the extremes.
Yeah, but that's not really the point, though. I don't think you're making.
No, he's talking about attachment of the pain, right? The suffering. He's saying,
Yeah.
"Oh my God, that's so traumatic," but I'm letting him know that people do it for fun, without even it being a big thing. Boxing,
Mhm.
you're just getting a paycheck. They're willing to kill themselves. You know what I mean? So I'm just putting things into perspective here. But yes, it's absolutely possible, 100%.
So let's just say, even this is possible.
Yes.
You just mentioned that only a few people among the human being could even have a chance to achieve that. You just mentioned that, if I understand correctly. I actually agree with that. If you look at the human history, the Buddhism, they seldom succeeded in building a country, a system sustained until now. They built some countries, in Thailand or whatever, but very quickly, it's replaced by. So I was wondering why, if this thing, if only a few people among human beings can achieve that, whatever detachment, what does that tell you? What does that tell? Why
It's
the
very
majority?
difficult, yeah.
Yeah, why? So if it's so difficult a theory, then how can they benefit the overall human beings?
Because if it was easy, everybody would be doing it.
Well,
There would be no
that's not
rewards.
the point, though. Like, the point
Everybody
is-
would get detached. There would be no suffering. People would be laughing around happy, but you have to go through the process of life, because you have to understand that even being in the body is suffering. Right now, like you're teaching a class, you're standing up or sitting down to a degree. To a degree, even standing is some sort of suffering, right? So suffering does exist. And if you want to go through those things, you have to go through the hardships of getting rid of the attachments. And that's when the benefits come. It's not just because everybody could do it. It's the people that want to do it. Do it.
Okay, let's pause for a sec for cost. So, okay, I think we have to define some terms here. So,
Sure.
one, the purpose of, we're gonna get to it. I'm gonna go to it in 2 minutes. The purpose of learning how to meditate and be mindful, there's different reasons why you can do it, but fundamentally, it's to have that more pure conscious sense of self, right? Which is no self, but that's still, I would say, a self. It's just the no self, right? It's the lowest form of self model that you can have. It's a
That doesn't make sense.
Because it's like looking through a window. There's still an object there, even though you can see through it, right? And so the point about suffering and stuff like that, we can discuss that more. We can come back to that later on a different day, because I think it's a long topic and there's different examples that we can go through. We could probably spend 2 hours on that topic. We came to this initially because of, he left the meeting. So because the being, right, has consciousness, and
Oh,
then we
wait.
develop self models, right? And then the self model can go really too far, almost past where it's healthy. And then through our development of culture, the Buddhists developed a method to reel it back, right? Back to the beingness or just being conscious. And there's a lot of different benefits for that. And some of the examples would be like the meditation that we get and like being able to withhold pain. And, you know, in the examples of torture, I'm sure that there's some people that have gotten really good as a skill, but it's not like they would opt to do that. Maybe if it was going to protect an entire village from being burned alive or something like that, some people would say, yeah, but it's not like neurologically, it's not a good idea to go through that, right? You're going to feel pain. It's just that you've developed the capacity to suppress that sensation of pain, right? And I think it would be flawed to say that you're not going to feel it. Like when he's giving the example of the boxer still feels it, but the boxer has adrenaline in his system. It's not someone strapped to a table without control, and there's no like you know, motivation or no autonomy. The boxer can choose to walk out of the ring if he wants to, right? And the monk can choose to not do what they're doing, but the person being tortured doesn't have a choice, you know? And so that changes the meaning of what's going on with the person in the concentration camp. That does change the meaning, you know what I mean? And so I think that because consciousness is the fundamental property, see, I wish you could listen and you could be here and hear the argument. You can listen to it later, maybe, of course. That's why we have YouTube. Because consciousness is the fundamental property, we can always go back to that, right? Now, the problem is if you get brain damage, if something happens to the front of your prefrontal cortex, your executive function gets damaged, right? Now, what are you going to do? You know, you really can't do very much at all, unless there's some support group that can like indirectly get you to meditate in some way, you know, maybe like for certain individuals that maybe have like Down syndrome or something like that, like, or some brain damage, they do certain activities that calms them down and it's almost like a meditative practice for them, but they're not actively doing it, you know? So I think we're necessarily, when Vikas was speaking, he's using the word you. What do you mean by you? What do you think you are, you know? And I think that you're human. And there's certain things, there's certain principles or inferences that are drawn from being human, the human condition. And there's some things we can know empirically. We can study the way the body functions, the way the brain functions. And there's some things we can know like a priori, philosophically, right? Okay, let us move to the 7 habits.